It is the 24th of November 1978 and an oil tanker is departing Saudi port Ras Tanura with a destination of the Portuguese port of Lixos. This journey would be far from problem-free. Her cargo is 114,000 tonnes of crude oil. Needless to say, it's a rather dangerous shipment. Carrying oil always has some inherent danger for both life and the environment if things take a little turn south. The ship would incur issues. Plans were thrown out when at Lixos, a ran-aground vessel closed the port. The ship would then be redirected to an oil terminal on the southern tip of Ireland in County Cork on an island named Whiddy Island. One of Ireland's worst industrial disasters would unfold there. Today we're looking at the Whiddy Island disaster or the Betelguese explosion. Today's video wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for my Patreon, YouTube and Ko-fi members. If you want early access to the channel's videos, then you can from just £1 per month. As always, the links will be in the pinned comment below. I've always been fascinated with Irish history. You may not know this, but I have dual citizenship of both the UK and ROI. Sasnach agus Ernach Isas Sligoch do Tailach Morha agus Librian Gwelga Lema Antin Ach Mogwelga Nime. Sorry for butchering the language there, but hey, RTE if you're looking for some awful cartoons and a disembodied voice for some history/disaster shows, my door is always open. And don't worry, there won't be much more Irish speaking during this video for me to butcher. Oh, I did miss the intro though, so here it goes. Jonas Anamdom, Agus Vulture, go plainly difficult. Whiddy Island. This is Bantry Bay. It's on the southern coast of the island of Ireland, in County Cork. The bay has a couple of islands, but for today we're only really focusing on Whiddy Island. Throughout its history, the island has shown to have strategic importance to the region. The British had built defences on the island in the 1800s, aimed at warding off a French invasion. Now, why is the bay so important? Well, it faces the Atlantic Ocean and is deep enough to accommodate very large vessels. The bay was also not massively built up like other ports in Europe, which again made it ideal for very large shipping. The island gained military use from the US during the closing years of the First World War. The country was still under British rule at the time, but after independence the island mainly saw use as a fishing community, albeit with a gradually declining population. In the 1960s, the island would see a new boom of economic activity. This was from the oil industry. Again, Bantry Bay's deep waters would end up being the reason for the renewed interest in the area. Let me explain. The oil industry was in the process of expanding shipping of crude oil across the globe. Soon enough, economics of scale seemed to be the most profitable way to ship oil. This essentially meant that oil tankers would get bigger and bigger and bigger. But although more economical to transport loads of oil on massive tankers, legacy ports around the world, and most apparently in Europe, were far too small and built up to accommodate such vessels. The company Gulf Oil expressed an interest in developing an oil terminal in Bantry Bay. This led to, in 1966, the Cork County Council granting planning permission for a new island terminal. Construction started a year later, with the site coming online in 1969. The terminal brought a lot of economic growth to the Bantry area. The success had been spurred on by the Suez Canal being closed after the Six-Day War and the occupation of Israel of the Sinai Peninsula from between 1967 and 1975. The closure had pushed the ultra-large shipping vessels' popularity further, as shipping had to navigate around Africa from the Middle East if it wanted to get to Europe. The oil terminal was laid out as such. It was made up of two parts, the offshore jetty and an onshore terminal. The terminal was on the southwest corner of Whiddy Island. It has a tank farm and other bits and pieces for operations. The farm has 12 crude oil storage tanks. Each one has a capacity of 80,000 tonnes. There are also 2 tanks for ballast, 2 for bunker oil, and 1 for diesel oil. These are all slightly smaller in size though. The jetty is connected to the onshore facility only via an underwater pipeline. which required any type of transfer of personnel or material from the jetty to the mainland was done via small ferries. The jetty was 1,600 feet long and was an island-type structure sat atop piles into the seabed. Access was via boat to the shore, and the jetty was claimed to have an ability to service ships with up to 500,000 tons of dead weight. The jetty had 2 berths, allowing 2 ships to be accommodated at one time. When berthing to the jetty, ships were assisted with up to 4 tugs and a pilot. When offloading oil is undertaken, articulated Chickson loading arms are employed. They are connected to the submarine pipelines, which then ran to the tank farm. Initially, the terminal saw good business, and the ultra-large oil tanker concept worked pretty well, with the Suez Canal being shuttable. However, in 1975, the Egyptian government opened the canal for shipping once again, and those big old bastard tankers were way too large to navigate the canal's locks and waterways. Thus, the whole operation around Bantry Bay began to waver. And as always, cost savings normally followed along, and less vessels visited the bay. This was the story towards the end of the 1970s, the same time as when our disaster took place. However, one of the vessels that would call at the oil terminal was the MV Betelguese. She was a 268 metre long by 38.9 metre wide ship with a gross weight tonnage of 61,766. She was built in 1968 and was owned by French company Total Petroleum, and had a complement of 42 crew. By the end of the 1970s, she was showing her signs of age, even though only being just over 10 years old. This was due to the whole cost savings and cutting backs, due to the whole ultra-large oil tanker concept starting to prove to be a little less economically viable. The disaster. So I mentioned at the start of the video that our disaster began on the 24th of November 1978. The oil tanker Betelguese had a rather frustrating journey, resulting in her directing to Whiddy Island, but she wouldn't reach there until the 4th of January 1979. The troublesome journey had meant that she was unable to lighten her load, thus her full 114,000 tonnes of flammable oil was still aboard. En route, she had discovered a leak, thus requiring her to be redirected back to France. But amazingly, the crew managed to fix it, allowing her to reach her destination on the southern tip of Ireland. The jetty, at her arrival in the morning, was occupied by the Betelgeuse's sister ship. As such, she wouldn't be able to dock until Saturday the 6th of January. A pilot was dispatched and assisted in berthing Betelgeuse. By 8 p.m. on the 6th of January, she was secured to the jetty. The discharge of her oil cargo began at 11:30 p.m. on the 6th. During this time, some of her crew went ashore. At around 1800 hours on the 7th, offloading was over for the heavy oil, and the valves to the lines to the onshore tanks were turned off, and the process of adding ballast began. This would take a little time, and would run into the early hours of Monday morning. However, at around 12:30, a fire started around the front part of the Betelgeuse. As the minutes dragged on, the fire increased in intensity, and suddenly spread on both sides of the vessel. A large plume of dense smoke emanated from the stricken vessel, and around the same time witnesses in Bantry could see the fire starting to unfold. At around 10 to 1 in the morning, a small explosion rang out from the ship, followed by smaller further detonations. Garda officers in Bantry Bay at around the same time observed the unfolding fire. They tried to ring through to the Gulf control room, but the line was already busy. The operator informed them that the company was aware of the fires. The Garda superintendent alerted the local fire officer, and the Bantry town fire siren was rung at around 1 a.m. At around the same time, a huge explosion erupted from the Betelgeuse's hull. The vessel was engulfed in a ball of fire, followed by further smaller explosions. Light from the main explosion had lit up the dark Bantry Bay. It was estimated that temperatures had soared to almost 1,000 degrees centigrade aboard the vessel as her remaining flammable cargo continued to ignite. The ship began to split in half, releasing flaming fuel out into the water. Although a hellish scene was being witnessed, local fire brigade members, along with firefighters from Skibbereen and Dunmanway, rushed towards the oil terminal on Whiddy Island. Locals offered up their fishing boats to assist in sending over people to help fight the flames. You see, if the fire spread back across to the terminal, the entire tank farm was in danger of exploding. Firefighters and Gulf employees sprayed the oil storage tanks with water in an effort to prevent another explosion. As the Betelgeuse fire raged on, parts of the jetty began to collapse into the water. But although the firefighters' efforts were valiant and rather successful in preventing further explosions, their progress was hindered. The island's fire truck failed to start, along with some Land Rovers that Gulf had provided for emergency services. The fire would continue for around 12 hours after the explosion, until the Betelgeuse sank at her moorings, extinguishing most of the flames. However, her bow defiantly remained above the waterline, releasing toxic smoke for another 2 weeks. Witnesses had seen figures aboard the vessel launched into the water upon the explosions. The personnel from the jetty and the ship wouldn't be found until the site was made safe. At first, 24 bodies were recovered. Some had washed ashore on Whiddy Island. Others had to be recovered by guarded divers. In total, 50 died in the explosion. This was the ship's crew and 8 Gulf employees based on the jetty. The disaster had quickly become one of Ireland's worst maritime events and had etched itself into the country's psyche. Understandably, the event was widely reported across Ireland and wider parts of Europe. It would also end up in one of the largest ship salvage operations in history up until that point. But what was the cause? Well, one massive reporter tribunal would be commissioned to dive into the underlying factors of the disaster. Ex-Dáil member and High Court judge Mr. Justice Costello was appointed to lead a tribunal inquiry into the disaster's investigation. The investigation and aftermath. So there were a number of witnesses to the fire and ultimate explosions, and after multiple interviews, understandably from the stress, reports were rather conflicting. Thus, estimates were relied upon for the timeline. Regardless, investigators were very keen to dig into the Betelgeuse's history and state on the night of the explosion. It would quickly become apparent that the ship was far from good condition. It was discovered that an inspection of the tanker just 9 months before the disaster had revealed at least 37 cracks in the crude oil tanks. Not good. And as we know that the oil leak had been reported to the ship's owners a week before the disaster, which had triggered the rerouting back to France, it was magically fixed to allow her to continue on to Whiddy Island, which seems like that the crew were just papering over the cracks to keep the ship going. Initially, after the explosions, inspections were carried out by divers on the 9th, 11th and 12th of January. Although in poor weather conditions, some hints to the ship's condition were able to be found, and this included some buckling across the observed structure. During the investigation, a floating hose was used to pump the remaining oil to the oil terminal to lighten the bow section, and this recovered 10,000 tonnes of oil. The recovery operations allowed investigators to get a better look at the Betelgeuse's hull. The ballast tanks were found to be very badly corroded. The bow was later towed out offshore and scuttled. It was apparent that no firefighting efforts were made by anyone on board the ship or on the jetty, as mentioned in the tribunal report. All the valves on the ship's firefighting system and the jetty's firefighting system were found to be closed, and it can be reasonably concluded that no efforts to fight the fire was made either by the ship's crew or the jetty crew. This hinted that the fire didn't start on the jetty and was thus possibly a sudden event aboard the ship. This was supported by the terrible state of the Betelgeuse, especially around its corroded ballast tanks. What's crazy was that the ship was just over a decade old, but she had been used and worked hard to within an inch of her life. This was due to the reducing economic viability of running the ultra-large crude oil carriers. The ship was structurally overloaded during its ballasting. It was estimated that the ballast tanks had been loaded to around 90% of their capacity in the number 2 to number 5 centre tanks, which had been weakened by progressive rusting around the sides and deck of the Betelgeuse. As ballast water was added, the ship's structure buckled around the 3rd or 4th tank area. This method of ballasting caused the buoyancy of the hull becoming uneven, which added stresses to the weakened ship. This ripped the ship's welds apart, which allowed flammable vapours to escape and make their way into the permanent ballast tanks. These vapours were then ignited by sparks being generated by the ship's buckling, which ultimately resulted in the initial fire. As the ship sank, more oil leaked out into the water, and the fire was able to spread to the number 5 and 6 oil tanks. Thus, the largest of the explosions occurred around 1 AM. The investigation placed the blame at the feet of the ship's owner, Total SA, who had basically allowed the death trap to continue working on the sea. This was due to them trying to get as much money out of their asset as possible. On top of this, Gulf was held to blame for the improperly maintained firefighting equipment. I mean, having a fire truck not being able to start is pretty shoddy. The design of the jetty was also a concern, with no way for crew and operators to get between the island and the jetty without using a boat. This essentially trapped everyone in the disaster zone. A fixed bridge or floating bridge would have saved lives, as they could have escaped the Betelguese and the jetty by foot. Now, the disaster cost Gulf over $120 million in the late 1970s. This included payouts to victims and the clean-up in the wake of the disaster. However, the company would not reopen the facility. Instead, the Irish government would take it over, turning it into the country's strategic oil reserve. An unloading buoy is now used for offloading oil tankers. So that's my video on the Bantry Bay Whiddy Island disaster. It's going to be a 4 on my disaster scale, and this is what I've got for my root cause analysis card. Do you agree? Let me know in the comments below. This is a Plain Difficult production. All videos on the channel are Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. Plain Difficult videos produced by me, John, in a currently very warm corner of southern London, UK. All I also have to say is thank you very much for watching, and Mr. Music, play us out please.